When people think about video streaming, obviously video is the first thing they think of, but audio is very important and plays a huge role in what you're trying to convey in the message that you have in your video. So this is kind of a primer for audio to kind of get you speaking the right lingo to the sound guys and being able to understand what an audio waveform looks like and how you treat it properly, make sure you're not going to distort it, and that you're going to get it into your video in a nice, clean, and efficient manner. It really does make a big difference for your audience when you have pleasing audio. And generally by pleasing audio, we mean there's no distortion, it's nice and clear, it's not too quiet, so they have to really strain to listen to it, and it doesn't vary too much, so it's not too dynamic. There aren't very quiet sections and then very loud sections, so they can sit and have an easy listening volume that plays throughout the whole presentation. So we need to understand a little bit about the audio signals to know how to treat them, how to record them properly without distorting them so that you do get a nice clean signal. This is an audio clip that I took from one of our videos that's promoting one of our products. I'm just going to try to play it here so you can hear what it sounds like. That didn't work. Let me just go up. Oh, it's back in presentation mode. So I'm not sure I'm going to be able to play it for you. But this is what a typical audio signal looks like. It looks very chaotic, but in fact it's very regular. You can see all those peaks. That's where the voice is actually speaking, and the quiet parts are the little bits in between that really don't make any sound. When you speak about audio with sound engineers, it's important to use the language that they use. And so I'm going to take a minute to talk about decibels. That is the unit that people measure sound in. So a lot of circuit engineers, when they're dealing with amplifiers and things, will work in voltage. But in general, people talk about decibels. And the reason we use decibels to talk about audio is that they more accurately reflect the perception of audio in the human ear. So it's a logarithmic scale. It can manage very, very quiet sounds and very, very loud sounds. Linear units like volts can't do that very easily. So if I was to express the normal range that we worry about in audio processing, in decibels it's minus 60 dBu to plus 30 dBu. So that's a nice manageable range with easy numbers. Compared to voltage, that's 0.0007 volts to 25 volts. And the range is not linear. So if I increase something by 6 dB and I increase it by 6 dB again and again, that is perceived to be the same amount of change over and over. Whereas if I use a linear scale like volts, as I increase that signal level, I need to increase it more the next time to get the same perceived value. So if I'm increasing by 1 volt, that's a perceived value. Then if I increase by 1 volt again, it doesn't seem like I increased it by the same amount. And so decibels more accurately reflect the way that you hear sound, and it makes it a lot easier to talk about sound. So decibels are the unit that most engineers will use when they're talking about audio. And there's two ways to use this unit. The first is an absolute reference. So this tells you literally what the sound level is, and you can take that and compare it to specifications. You can use it in order to meter. And it's things like line level on the record out is minus 10 dBV. So the dBV means it's decibels reference to a volt. Okay, so the volt is a very specific number, and that tells you what the level is. Similarly, if I said the maximum rating on this recorder input is 12.3 volts peak, that's an absolute number that you can, it's not relative to anything, it's an absolute number. Or if I say the nominal level on this mixer is plus 4 dBu, that is an absolute number that you can measure. But they also use decibels to be something that's relative. So when I say I need something quieter, or I say we've got 18 decibels of headroom, it's implied that the reference is where I am relative to where I will clip. So the clipping point is the implied reference. And so this is not really an absolute number. That signal could be coming in at all kinds of different levels depending on the equipment I'm using and be 18 decibels away from the clipping point. So it's relative to some implied reference. Similarly, if I said I need 10 dB of attenuation, that doesn't talk about how what level the signal is at or what level I need the signal to be. It just says I need it to be 10 dB different than what it is now. So these are just some examples of how decibels are used both in an absolute reference and in a relative reference to describe the signals. That one's kind of hard to see. It's a little bit dark. But can anyone see the actual green waveform on that? Oh, that's really unfortunate. Let me see if I can. All right. So I'll show this picture. It's the one before it is really a zoom in of this picture. And what I'm trying to get across is even though we have these absolute numbers measured in decibels to describe a signal, you can see these signals vary a lot over time. So as the person's speaking or as you're making it through a musical passage, that level, that audio level is going to go up and down quite drastically from time to time. And so it's not possible to assign a singular value and say this audio signal is at 4 dB and completely describe the nature of the signal and completely tell you everything you need to know about the signal in order to record it and not have it clip. So what we do is we break this into two measurements. The first measurement is an average, kind of average value. It's a root mean square or RMS value. And it tells you the relative average level of that signal. Okay, so that tells you roughly how loud it seems to the human ear. And then we look for the peak amplitude. So we need to know how much above that average value will the signal get. And that's just called the peak amplitude. And the difference between those two is what we call the dynamic range. Yep.
What's the difference between dB, dBu, dBc?
Okay. So dB just means there's an implied reference. So it's not specific to any level. dBu is specific to a reference which is 0.775 volts. dBV is specific to 1 volt exactly. And so unfortunately there are multiple references that get used in the industry. And those you'll also see dBm is specific to a milliwatt and dBw is specific to a watt if you're measuring power of the signal. So that extra letter on the end tells you exactly what it's measured to. So technically, yes, those should be dBu or dBm or something on my chart. So the dynamic range should be measured in decibels, which it is, but you're right, on my chart there, the average value should be 19.5 dBu or dBV or something specific. So the difference between the peak amplitude, where the signal is the loudest or the most intense, and the average value, that's your dynamic range. And that's really important because it tells you how much that signal is going to vary. Because the average level is very easy to measure and very easy to deal with, but that average is just that, it's an average. And those peaks are going to come in, and if they're much higher than that average value, you have a real risk of clipping that signal. And so we want to avoid clipping the signal as much as we can. And by clipping, this is what I mean. So the signal on the far left there's no clipping. So it's a nice rounded waveform. This is kind of a sinusoid, single frequency tone if you want. And there's no clipping. But you can see analog clipping and digital clipping, while they're slightly different, they're very similar in that they're gonna cut off the top of that waveform. And when I do that, I'm not just making that peak quieter, I'm actually changing a lot about that waveform. I'm adding harmonics that don't exist there. And that's when you hear that distortion. So similar to an electric guitar effect, when you put that through a distortion pedal and you hear all that distortion, those are just extra harmonics that are being added into the signal. And by clipping the top off the signal, that's exactly what you're doing. And so when you hear something being overdriven or overloaded, that's the result of clipping. And so every piece of equipment is going to have some upper limit at which it's going to start to clip the signal. It can only handle a certain upper limit of signal level, and you need to know what that is in order to avoid this clipping. I'm going to try one more time, see if I can get this one to play. I'm sorry. That didn't go. Try one more time here. Okay, I apologize.
Our original Pearl is ideal when portability is key. It comes with a hard shell carrying case, and because of its small size, it can be set up just about anywhere.
Okay, so you can hear the clipping that's in that tone, right? It's not nice to hear, and it completely changes the texture of what's been recorded. So you can see the difference visually between the original recording, which I've got small on the right-hand side, and the clipped one, which I've amplified on the left-hand side, and you can see those peaks that are just nicely on the original are all cut off on the amplified version. And that's what gives you that really harsh, distorted sound once you've clipped it. And so that's what we're trying to avoid as we set up our equipment. So there's a few things you can do, obviously, to avoid clipping. The first is know both the nominal level, or that RMS average level of the signal that you're dealing with in absolute terms. So know whether you're getting a signal that's approximately minus 10 dBu or dBV. And then know what the dynamic range of that signal, how far above that average are those peaks, and how close are you going to be to the limit of the equipment that you're using. And then you need to ensure sufficient headroom on that equipment. So you need to calculate how much room you need, and then with the equipment and the meters, which I'll show you a little later, you'll be able to detect whether or not you're actually achieving that. And as a last resort, there is technology called limiting, which will kind of clip the signal for you, but do it in a kind of gentler way. So if you have a signal which is definitely going to clip, you probably want to do it proactively rather than let the equipment do it reactively. Of course, it's not that easy just to use amplitude or signal levels to avoid clipping. So if you just turn things down so that those peaks don't clip, then you run into the problem where parts of the speech are too quiet to hear. Because if you just turn down the volume, you're not only affecting those peak levels and moving them away from the clipping point, which is what you want, you're also taking the quieter passages and you're turning those down as well. So turning down the volume or turning down the level is one way to avoid clipping, but you can run into the problem with signals with high dynamic range that then the quiet portions are too quiet. Okay, so that's one problem. The second is a scenario like this where you've got multiple speakers, multiple microphones. I might get up here and it might sound fine, and then Ryan gets up here with a different mic or he speaks a little more loudly, and suddenly he begins to clip. So when you're producing an event like this, you need to be aware that different microphones or even different speakers will produce different levels, and you need to be able to accommodate that. And that's what a sound check is usually for. And then similarly, if you're doing things, especially like live bands, during the sound check, everything sounds great, but then when they get up on the stage, and especially in that last set, everybody's all excited. They start singing a little louder, playing a little louder, and you start to clip. So, getting your levels right is one thing, but there are these other challenges around dynamic range that's going to really make it difficult. And that's where compression comes in. And the whole idea behind compression is to be able to reduce that dynamic range. So if you've got peaks that are way above your average value, and you know they're going to clip, so you have to turn the signal down, what you want to do is bring up the low sections and bring down the high sections and kind of push them together, and that's why it's called compression. And you can see this signal is kind of compressed. It's the same waveform that we've been looking at in all these slides, but now there's not those tiny little quiet parts. Those have been brought up to bigger levels, and the peaks have been kind of tamed down a bit. And it helps to make a more pleasing audio so that it brings those levels together, and it makes it much easier to record because your dynamic range is greatly reduced. So in the original clip I showed you, we had a dynamic range that was about 30 dB. It was very broad. This one's been compressed down to 6 dB, so it looks very different. Classical music, just to give you an idea of dynamic range and what it sounds like, classical music typically has a large dynamic range, and I'm going to try to play this clip, and we'll see. You can watch the meter as it plays. Let's see how much it varies. So you can see it was into the green, it went into the yellow, and I think on very rare occasion into the red. So that was a signal that has a moderate amount of dynamic range. By contrast, if you look at typical pop music, it has much less dynamic range. You can see the meter there is really at the yellow level and just pushing into the red, but it's never going beyond the yellow. It's always kind of in that very narrow range. And so depending on the music that you're trying to capture or the sounds that you're trying to capture, whether it's a human's voice or whether it's a band or pre-produced music, they will all have different levels of dynamic range. And so you can get away with some things if you've got signals that are already produced, like mastered music. You need a lot less dynamic range for something like this than you would for live recorded music or something like classical music that uses a much broader range. So There are rules of thumb on how much dynamic range you might need for a given event, but it does vary based on what kind of signal it is you're trying to capture. And over time and experience, you'll get to know sort of what levels you need. I don't want to spend a lot of time on this chart, but only to say that there are two basic levels that audio signals get broken into. There's mic level, meaning from a microphone, and those are very, very low levels, typically in around minus 60 dBu or minus 50 dBu. And then there are line levels. And line levels are much harder. They're the things that are much higher, sorry. They're the things that would come out of your computer output, come out of a mixer, come out of a tape deck, that kind of thing. Unfortunately, there are multiple kind of standards or very typical levels for line levels. So someone tells you they're giving you a line level signal, that's really not enough to know everything you need to know. You have to ask, what level is that really at? And so one of the most popular levels out of something like a Pro mixer would be 4 dBu. They're also very popular at 0 dBu. So those are different values, but they both come from Pro level mixers, and it just depends which make, which model. And then if you get consumer level gear, typically like the output from your laptop or something from a tape deck or an iPod, that would be more in a minus 10 dBV is typically how it's specified. And so here I've just shown a quick chart to be able to convert between volts, dBV, dBu, and there are lots of these converters either on the internet or even apps for your phone. So if you find yourself needing to translate between one spec that says it can only be a maximum of 6.3 volts, and another spec is telling you it's coming out at minus 8 dBu, and you need to understand whether that's compatible, you need to convert them. And so there are lots of these apps that you can download for your phone or web pages you can go to, or you can plug in the formulas that I had previously on the decibel page to actually calculate them. For each of the mixers that you'll run across, they do have output specifications. So I chose one here, an example is an Allen Heath mixer, and the output specification is typically as 0 dBu nominal, and this one is 21 dBu maximum. And what that tells me is when the sliders are adjusted so that it's not amplifying the signal, he's just mixing, which is where you normally want to be, and the meters are just in the green stage and just touching into the yellow. Okay, that's normally how you want to run your mixer. That's considered the nominal level. Then the output from that, the average value, will be 0 dBu. So that tells me, yes? Okay, that tells me roughly what that average level is going to be, but it doesn't tell me anything about the dynamic range. It doesn't tell me where will the peaks be relative to that signal. And so the 21 dBu maximum is telling me that this mixer will begin to clip the signal itself if the dynamic range is more than 21 dB. So I know for sure it's not going to be greater than 21, or it's already going to be distorted coming out of the mixer. Okay, so the sound guy who's operating the mixer, if that's you or that's someone you're working with, is going to have to manage the levels of the signal to make sure they don't exceed 21 dBu of dynamic range. And then if you take that signal and you want to record or stream that signal, you know that it's going to be in that range somewhere, right? Yeah?
Can you talk about from a phone or headphones or from a computer, that output?
Yeah. I'll flip back to this chart real quickly. So the basic consumer level, minus 10 dBV, is what you would get out of mostly things like tape decks or TVs, things like that. Out of something like a headphone jack or especially an iPod output or something like that, it tends to be quite a bit lower. So you're probably in more of the minus 15, minus 18 dBV from something like an iPod. I know I have a Samsung Galaxy S5 and it comes in around minus 15, not minus 10. So it will be lower than that value typically. Okay. So I'm just going to skip ahead a little. These analog meters are set up so that the VU, or sorry, the point you want to measure against is called 0 VU, and that's your nominal level. So it's green all the way up to 0, then it goes yellow, then it goes red. And so in an analog scheme, you're trying to line up your good value to the 0 point. But in a digital meter, okay, it runs a little bit differently. It's hard to see in this particular example, but the 0 point is at the top, and that is the clipping point. So you're not trying to run on the digital side, you're not trying to run at 0, you're trying to stay away from 0. So on the analog meter, you're trying to line everything up to 0. On the digital side, 0 is where you're going to clip, and you want to be minus 18, minus 15, minus 20 dB below that. And so you typically line up your meters where the analog is running at 0 and the digital is running at about minus 18. You'll notice the green LEDs and the yellow LEDs, they correspond. So at least when you're using the two systems, if you're in the green, you're good on both sides. But you just need to be aware that 0 is not always good in the digital world. And so I'm going to give one example if I have a moment. If I was recording acoustic guitar and a singer, and it's coming in at plus 4 dBu is what it's coming from the mixer, and I have an encoding spec that says I can't go more than 0.7 volts RMS, that's where I'm going to clip, and I have encoder gain that I can use to adjust from 0 to 30 dB. What I end up doing is the plus 4 dBu is way too much for that 0.707, so I converted the 0.707 to dBu, and that comes out to minus 1. So I need a signal that's minus 1 dBu maximum. And I'm going to get something out of the mixer that's already plus 4 at the nominal level. The peaks are going to be above that. So I need to insert an attenuator. So I put a 25 dB attenuator in there, pulls the signal way down to minus 21, so I can get it into my digital recorder. And then I use the gain setting inside of the recorder to bring that up to minus 16. And that gives me 15 dB of headroom, which is comfortable for recording that kind of thing. So I had to rush a little bit at the end here to fit it all in, but basically, what you're trying to do is make sure you understand the specs of the equipment that you're using, properly understand the analog meter and how that works, and how the digital meter works on the other side, and avoid that clipping point. Use compression if you have to, but most times you can just be really conservative on your headroom, give lots of headroom, and you won't clip. There is a more detailed white paper. I really skimmed across a lot of these topics. If you go to our website and go to Audio 101, you'll get a white paper that goes into compression and limiting and all this stuff, dynamic range, in a lot more detail. So I know this was kind of a quick run by. If you want more details, you can do that, or stop by our booth. I'd be happy to answer any questions or speak to you more about it.